Well, hey, everyone, welcome back to a Holy Podcast, where we look at whatever the topic was from the previous Sunday, and we go a little bit deeper into the topic. So this past Sunday, we talked on everybody's favorite topic. No one feels awkward about it at all. We talked about sexual morality. And actually, initially, my wife was scheduled to be on this, but Stacy begged to be on this podcast because she said, I love awkward topics and I want to be on this. So thank you for filling in for Mary. And we did joke, and I said that we were just going to have her read long portions of Song of Solomon just to see if she could do it. And she literally said, I will leave the podcast.
Yep, with a bright red face.
With a bright red face, yeah. Do you get red if you get embarrassed?
Yes.
Okay, you know, it's interesting. I've been around you a long time. I've never seen you get red.
She's like, please don't test that theory right now.
Or at least I feel like I do.
You
I
feel
at least
warm,
get hot. Like
I was saying, I've been around you for years, and I've never seen your face get
Well, that's
red.
good.
So
I'm
yeah,
glad.
it's not obvious. I can't say that about everyone on staff. I'm not going to say it because I don't want to embarrass them, but there's a couple people on staff, specifically one I'm thinking of. Have you ever seen anyone on staff get red? There's one person that
I'm trying to pull it. I'm trying to think.
Well, I'm not going to say because I don't want to embarrass this person, but I learned this years ago because I knew someone that was close to me had this condition where they got embarrassed, they got red. And when people acknowledge it, it just made it worse. So it created almost an insecurity. So nowadays, if someone in front of me gets red, I will not acknowledge it at all, or I'll try to downplay it because I don't want, just to create that thing in their head. You know what I mean? So, all right. Well, let's dive into this topic. So even before the cameras went live, we were just kind of talking about how we were raised with this topic. I was raised, I'm very thankful for this, in a home where my dad and mom, solid Christians, my dad's a pastor, and sex was a topic that was very comfortable to discuss. So I remember, this is even kind of strange as I say this, but I remember vividly as a kid being around when other people would ask my dad questions and he would just answer it from the Bible and discuss it. It was very comfortable. My mom worked in our youth ministry. She would speak to us and talk about it. So I was just raised in an environment where it was super comfortable. So I'm thankful for that because it's created a comfort inside of me to want to talk about it. But it is something, and this is kind of where I want to begin. I haven't prepped you guys for this one, but it's a softball question. But why is it important for us to talk about these topics? Because I think for some, they would think like, man, the church, that's the last place in the world that should be talking about sex because, let's just be honest, our culture has so perverted sexuality. It does seem like a dirty or taboo topic. But why is it important for us in the church to address these types of topics?
because God has something to say about it. You know
For
what
sure.
I mean? And the world has something to say about it. So we need to talk about it because, we were talking about it before the cameras came on. I have a daughter and I'm like, I want to be purposed to talk to her about it as much as we possibly can. I know it's going to be uncomfortable for her, but to really put that out there because she's going to hear things. She's going to hear her friends say things. She's going to hear probably teachers say things. She's going to hear the world telling her one message. And I want to make sure that she knows what God's message is on this topic.
Absolutely.
I was going to say, you're being discipled in some way. So like there are messages that we're encountering on sex every single day. You were raised in a home where you guys had open conversations with your parents. I was raised in a home, it was never a dirty thing or anything like that, but it always revolved around jokes. It always revolved around what we were taking in through media and through things like that. And so I was discipled a lot through the messages of media about what sex was and what sex wasn't. And so that reality hasn't changed from the time when I was young. So the reality is we're always talking about sex. We're always thinking about sex. You mentioned it on Sunday, like it's everywhere. Right. And so if the Bible has something to say about it and our culture is teaching us something, we have to decide what's going to disciple us. And so I think it's important for that reason.
Yeah. And the reality is it's not a question of if you're going to hear about it or if it's going to be talked about. It's when, and as you just said, it's all the time. And so especially for children, as they're growing up in Christian homes, one of our chief responsibilities is to disciple them. And so in all things, right? Again, according to what God's word teaches, it's similar to the topic of money, especially in church where people are uncomfortable. But the way that I look at it is money and sex are both very powerful things that affect everybody's lives. And so if we're not informed with a biblical worldview of how to think about it, how to live it out, how to deal with it, and then I think the other part of it is there's a stigma oftentimes attached to it. And I think being able to remove that when people live in shame, they're not willing to talk about things. They're not willing to address those things. They're not willing to listen to things about, and that I think stunts people's growth and transformation and, their discipleship. And so I think even removing the stigma of, hey, we want to be the type of church, we want to be the type of people that are able to talk about anything. That doesn't mean you have to do it in a crass way or talk about things in a way that's irreverent, but being able to address issues head on, I think, is really one of the things that the church should always be seeking to do.
Yeah, one of the things I was thankful for from this past Sunday was a lot of the feedback that I got. People saw it being taught in a redemptive way. Like that was a common thing where people said, and I even acknowledge it. One of the tensions that sometimes happens in the church world, and I'm guilty of this, is you get up and you talk about what sex is not, and because we are combating this message from culture that is not biblical, and so it's easy to spend a ton of our a lot of our energy going, well, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. But this past Sunday, I was trying to say this is what God said it is, and so there was a redemptive element to it. But let's just talk about that for a second. We have these two messages. You have the message of culture that says sex is simply an appetite that needs to be filled, and it is an expression, and really there should be no rules. That our culture would teach that the more progressive we get with as a culture, that we should become more and more free in sex and experience it. So that's like on one side. On the other side is a restrictive standard that God has established, but it's not simply restrictive for the sake of restriction. It's how he designed it to be. But when these two things combat each other, or when they come into conflict, it does seem very unloving. The biblical ethic of sex seems unloving when you're saying to someone, no, what you want to do, you can't do, and that's even evil or wrong. Why? So here's the question. Why is it more loving to believe and express the biblical sexual ethic than it is to embrace what our culture teaches as a sexual ethic?
I think that oftentimes what we're doing is we're living under an illusion when we try to embrace the truth that culture teaches. It says, and it tries to live by this idea of I can define my own idea of what is healthy sexuality and what is good for me as far as it goes with sexuality. The reality is nobody knows us like God does, and nobody loves us like God does. And so if culture gets to define it and anything goes and we get to define what's best for us, it does seem unloving. But if the reality is that there is a creator, someone who designed us, someone who loves us more than we could even possibly love ourselves, if he has something to say about our sexuality, he is going to be the one who knows best. And it's going to be most loving to do what is best for us in sexuality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the straightforward. I mean, that's the foundation of this conversation. Really, any conversation. Again, if God is the one who designed us, then He knows how things are supposed to be. And so, the reality is, if we want to experience a deeper, more fulfilling, not only sex life, but life in general, we want to experience deeper intimacy with our spouse, all of that stuff, God has laid out a plan for that. Right. So there's the pro side of it, right? The good side. The other side is really the defensive side is when we do things according to the way God designs, it's a safeguard to the physical, spiritual, emotional, relational damage and destruction that is caused by doing things outside of God's design for human flourishing. So we get both sides of it. We get protection from some of the damage and destruction that it can cause when we do things the wrong way, but we also get to experience the fulfillment and enjoyment that God intended, and we honor Him. Again, always going back to if we're followers of Jesus, we should want to reflect and honor God in all the things that we do, and we get to experience the benefit of that as well.
Yeah, my response is the exact same. Just, you think about it, you say this often, culture could care less about us. You know what I mean? Like, culture doesn't care what happens to us. They're really just, they want to make money. They this, that, or the other. And then when you look at it and you go, yeah, it may look restricting from God, from what God wants for it, but man, He does it from a place of love, know, and we've been talking about this. Everything that God calls us to do, it's for our betterment. So that this, with the topic of sex, having a healthy sex life, it's the same thing, that God is telling us, He's giving us these parameters, not from a place of like, I don't want you to have fun, I don't want you to enjoy, but from a place of like, I love you and I know what's best for you.
Yeah, for sure. I was thinking about this morning, I oftentimes think in analogies. It's just because of being a teacher for long enough that's a rhythm. But I was thinking about like if if someone in our culture, so like say a medical doctor, and think about like if someone had diabetes, if that medical doctor comes to them and says, based on all of my experience, based on all my education, if you continue to eat this food, it's going to be damaging to you. And that person goes, yeah, but I really love this food. Our culture would say, well, then let them eat the food, right? Like let them, and they would say, ignore the evidence, ignore what the doctor's saying. And we can look at it on a medical sense, and all of us would look at that, and the whole culture would look at that and go, well, no, don't do that. You want, you would have to agree with the doctor. And yet our culture wants to disconnect from the damaging effects of what we're seeing with the sexual ethic of our culture right now. And that is a weird thing. So, I mean, this is a really broad question, but why do you think the culture doesn't want to acknowledge the damaging effect of going all the way back to the sexual revolution in the 60s to where we are now, or just looking at it now? Why doesn't our culture want to acknowledge what is, I would say, really, really obvious? You know what I mean? Like one of the things I said on Sunday is like, I can't over exaggerate the damaging effect of the sexual revolution and all the different things, and yet our culture doesn't want to acknowledge it. Right. It still wants to continue to say the same message over and over. It's just sex. It's just physical. And yet I don't think anyone actually believes that in their core. So why do you think that is?
I think for me, when I think about that question, I think we place the highest value and really the more important narrative of our society is personal expression, bodily autonomy. That concept overrides everything else. So the concept is, if you are a person who feels that you need or desire to express yourself in this way, whatever that might look like, then that is the highest good, because personal autonomy, that individual expression, is what our culture seems to be promoting from every which way. I would say in addition to that, you mentioned it just a couple minutes ago, there's the money aspect. I mean, let's be honest, it's a billion-dollar industry, whether it be sex being promoted in movies, whether it be pornography, the pornography industry, whether it be even in marketing items, consumer products that are not even related to anything sexual, but using sex as a way to market it. So it's a billion-dollar thing. So for them to be even able to recognize, hey, there's some unhealthy things, we would have to scale back and really change the entire narrative of our culture, which is, I think in a lot of ways, they're just not willing to make that sacrifice.
Right. Do you remember, I mean, I'm sure you guys do, Axe body spray when it first came out in commercials. It was interesting because the basic premise of the commercials was, and I'm going to use language here, it's just kind of crude, but unfortunately I don't know how else to do this. But if you use this product, like women will throw themselves at you and you can get laid. Like that was the basic concept of the commercials. So a guy would spray it and literally women would be jumping on them. And like, I remember the first time I saw it, I was so repulsed by it. I was a youth pastor at the time, where I was like, this is so stupid. It's like absurd. And then you saw the sales go like through the roof for it. And the target audience was junior high and high school boys. And because they saw it, and they were dumb enough to believe it, of going like, all I have to do is spray this and girls are going to love me. Yeah. It's crazy, but that was like, again, it was that message that was just so bizarre.
Well, I think you do take in the idea and have to wrestle with the tension of the fact that God has created us to be sexual beings, to have sexual appetite, that is part of us, and that's wired into us. It's it's the twisting of that that culture takes and goes, okay, so this, and I would say, I'm not one to say there's a spirit behind everything. Like that's not my MO, but when you think about like the cosmic powers and the demonic ideas and things that happen, what they do is they just take and they twist good things just slightly to the place where now it's not the good thing anymore. And so we have taken and adopted a posture in our culture and in our lives. And I would say that we, even in the church at times, a lot in the church at times, have bought this idea that, like you said, we are our own we're our own gods. We're autonomous. So what feels good right now is what's best for me right now. And so that's what I'm, and so with that twisting, with that idea of like, there's no reason to answer to another structure or another authority, and just do what feels great right now.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I want to add one other thing. I mean, I think there's an element in secular culture I've said this about, you see those stories of people who have it all according to the world standards, right? They have, like, you think someone like a Tom Brady, right? Who, was married to a beautiful woman, is incredible at what he did in playing football, winning, all these Super Bowls, has more money than he knows what to do with, all these things. And, this was years ago, but he had some quotes of just kind of saying, isn't there more to life? Like, he was wrestling with that. And I think there's some element of culture where it's like, you're looking at, okay, what feels good? What gives me some experience of pleasure? And then that must be it. It's really a humanistic way of thinking. And you talked about this in the sermon on ownership, right? If we think in this way that there is no God, well, what else would we pursue?
Right.
And you mentioned it Sunday, if the human orgasm is one of the most powerful things, the most powerful experiences that people can have, well, then it makes sense because we're not shooting for anything higher. If this is all there is, and I think that's where, again, the Christian narrative is, number one, sex is good, it is beautiful, but it's actually more fulfilling in the way God intended it. But even that and the gifts that God has given us himself are meant to point back to him, that the ultimate fulfillment of our longing, of our desire, of our pursuit of joy and contentment is found in him. So I think there's another element of it that it is sad, because it's basically saying, this is as good as it's going to get, so therefore you might as well pursue sex because there's nothing better.
Right. I just saw this past week. There's a guy who has a podcast, and his name is slipping my brain right now, but he is a guy that I think is very much on the pursuit of faith. Like, just hearing some of the different things that he has said and experienced. But on his podcast, he brings in a lot of military guys, former special forces guys.
Jocko?
It's not Jocko, but it's similar concept like that. Okay. But this guy brings him on, and he brings on CIA people and different stuff. So it has very much a male-driven theme to it. So I'm not sure Stacy's going to love it, but what's interesting is he brings on guys, both just military guys, but also military guys oftentimes that have a faith or some type of a experience. And he had a guy on, and he was talking to him, and he said, like, he was talking about life and relationships, and he asked this guy, he goes, so what's your key to having a healthy marriage then? And this is a military guy. And he goes, this won't be popular, but I'll tell you, it's to pursue Jesus. He goes, if you want to have a healthier marriage, he goes, the more you fall in love with Jesus and follow him, the more you'll love your wife better and she'll respond to it. And he goes, our culture doesn't want to tell you that. And this is, again, not on a Christian platform, but this guy's proclaiming it. And I thought, yes, that's the message of the scripture. Like what you were just saying is, that's what God would say is like, I can give you even greater pleasure in this area, but it's always going to point to me because from me is the source of that life and experience. Okay, so when we look at it and the idea of teaching and proclaiming of sexual ethics, of the biblical sexual ethics, I think for some, when they think about it, like Paul says something that's really important, I think, to this, is sometimes people look at the sins that they commit as if it's just a momentary thing. If I tell a lie now, it's a lie now, and I need to acknowledge it, but it's not really hurting my future. But I think all of us have seen that deception. Someone gets in the habit of a small lie, turns into a consistent lie, turns into like they become a liar, right? And we could use that example with many other sins. What Paul says about sex is powerful. He says, every other sin a person commits, they commit outside the body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. Paul is acknowledging that all sins, I want to be clear, in the eyes of God seem to be equal, but not all of them are equally damaging. Some are damaged more. And so when we look at this and we teach it and proclaim it as a church, we're proclaiming it because we recognize this is an area that has the potential to have lasting negative effects in someone's life and relationships. Can you guys speak to some of the things that you've learned and experienced from, whether it be your own life or just being in ministry, talking with people, counseling with people, seeing the damaging effects? Because I want our audience to understand that this is a sin that comes with lasting effects, because we want to protect them and help them to avoid things that can be damaging later on.
Anthony mentioned earlier the idea of shame that's wrapped around sex often. And I know, and I'll just even come from my own personal experience. And growing up, I was just, I'll just say it. Growing through high school, going through college, like was not the most pure time in my life. I'll just say it that way. I struggled with pornography. I struggled with just all different types, just with sexual expression. And so like all of those things, I just struggled with all of that. And so the amount of shame and the amount of heart, even talking about it now, if I look uncomfortable, it's because I am. And because there's still that level of, I hate that's part of my life. I hate that was part of that's part of my story. God has redeemed it. God has transformed it in 1,000 different ways. And I love that. But that shame is hard to shake. And it is something that sits with you for, I would say for a very long time, that needs applied to the blood of Jesus needs applied to more times than I would more times than I wanted to, if I can say it that way.
Yeah.
You spend a lifetime trying to overcome something that seemed right in the moment because it was pleasurable, and you spend the rest of your life living with the damaging effects of it. And so,
yeah, I think, one of the things that I think we don't realize is that it does bleed over into marriage, so you think, oh, this won't impact my marriage. I did it at 17 years old. But just a simple thing like pornography, how many times have we heard somebody think like, once I get married, I won't have that issue. It won't be an issue for me anymore. But the truth is that's not always the case.
For sure.
Because then you take that and apply it to your marriage, and you could then almost compare your spouse to what you've seen, what you've experienced there, and they might not match up. And so it can be super damaging. You have that in your past. And I'm not saying God can't redeem it, but you have it in your past. You bring it into your marriage. Your spouse has no idea that you have this, and maybe the truth comes out or whatever. And then your spouse might feel less than, your spouse is going to feel like, oh man, I wasn't worth you waiting for that. Maybe I don't measure up. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I'm not meeting those needs of yours because I'm not doing what you experienced through pornography or this, that, or the other. And so it's super damaging. It is amazing how like one decision, it can trickle. And then even with that, if it is pornography or maybe you just start sending flirtatious texts, man, it can lead to very damaging things real quick just because of one decision that you made that escalated.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the effects are widespread. I mean, in so many ways. I think, maybe in the 90s, the focus was always on like the physical effects, STDs, unwanted pregnancy, which to me, I mean, of course, those are realities, but there's so many other things, as we've been saying, that people do not realize that affected them later on. I mean, diminished ability to experience intimacy once a person gets married because of the baggage that they've carried with them, the shame, feelings of even almost kind of it's revolting to them because of their experiences in the past, diminished sexual capacity, particularly for men because of pornography. So the things that they've seen, they're not able to be blunt, to be as aroused because they've distorted their perspective of what sex looks like and what it should be experienced in marriage. So there's all of those things. I think even relational tension about past. I mean, I know that's been something where a person maybe discovers that their spouse, their husband, their wife was promiscuous in the past, and that's something they've carried into the marriage, and it's something they struggle with, even though they maybe knew it prior. Some people found out afterward. It's a tension that they struggle with, picturing their spouse and all of those things. So there is really an emotional breakdown that can come from a lot of that stuff, and it can affect the relational dynamic, and not only just, again, physical intimacy, but at a higher level as well in a marriage.
Yeah, I had a couple that I knew many, many years ago, over a couple decades ago, and I remember talking with them. I was very close to both of them, and this was an issue in their marriage. They just had a hard time with intimacy. And I remember the wife said about her husband, she said, well, basically he's just a pervert. He just wants to have sex all the time. And so like when we clarified, I was like, is he wanting to do perverted things? She was like, no, he just wants to have sex all the time. And again, I'm giving details just to show a context of how this can impact. And I was like, what's all the time? She was like, multiple times a week. And I was like, okay, this doesn't feel perverted, what you're saying. And so as we got into it, and again, they're both in the room, we're talking with it, what it turned out to be was she was promiscuous in her past, but in a way that guys just used her consistently. That's how she felt. One night stands. That's how people wanted. So the intimacy that her husband longed to have with her, which was actually beautiful and healthy, he was attracted to her, he wanted to connect. She saw that as perversion, as using her, and they had to really work through that. They did. I was very thankful for that. They worked through that. but that was damaging to them. And you alluded to the idea, I've talked to many single guys that were addicted to pornography, and they will say out loud, I just can't wait to get married so this can resolve this addiction I have. And I would say, I promise you it won't, because you are training your body. And even in that, what you're viewing and seeing in pornography is a make-believe sexual world that just simply does not exist. And so now in their minds, their anticipation of like, marriage is going to fix it because my wife is going to act like this porn star that I'm looking at. And then when their wife, who isn't looking at porn, has no desire to look at porn, has no desire to fulfill that, doesn't even know about that, ignorance, because it's not natural or normal, all of a sudden she's not living up to it. They're frustrated. So what do? They run back to pornography. And so like it just becomes like we've all said, this like ongoing damaging thing. So when God steps into this, into our culture and proclaims his truth still through the word and through his people who proclaim it, he's not trying to limit people's pleasure. He's trying to limit their pain. He's trying to allow 100%. For true intimacy to happen. Okay. So for a moment now, let's pivot. So if someone's listening, we'll kind of go down some different groups. So if there's a single person who's listening who has been sexually promiscuous, whatever standard you want to use for that, one partner, many partners over the years, whatever it might be, what would your advice be to someone like that who now goes, okay, I didn't understand it. I'm understanding it more. What can I do from this day forward, as Paul says, to flee sexual immorality? What does that look like for a single person? What would you advise them?
First thing I would say is fall at the feet of Jesus. You know what I mean? Like seek that forgiveness, ask him to help you change, continually seek after the Holy Spirit, allowing, the wisdom, the guidance, the help that you need. But then you have to put things in place. Like it really is work. It is work to put things in place now to set yourself up for success later.
Absolutely.
This is going to sound funny, but I don't mean it that way, but find a hobby. I mean,
that's great, Chris.
It is good. I was not, if you were to say, guess what Chris is about to say, I was like, not that.
Well,
no, I get it though.
You know what I mean? So like keeping yourself busy oftentimes take your mind off of it, because I remember my life drastically changed. I was a senior in high school. My lifestyle slowly kind of began to conform to who Christ was and what he was doing. So through my freshman year, through my sophomore year of college, even, like I was still working through my ideas of sexuality and my ideas of what it meant to live a godly lifestyle with that. And so once I hit my junior year, it was something I was super committed about. And so like, I started running, you know what I mean? And so like running became a thing for me where, I tied my desire to stay pure with that, and I'm trying to remember how my mindset worked on it completely, but essentially what it was my motivation to do something other than occupy myself with pornography or whatever it was, you know what I mean? So it was just being busy and staying involved in with other people, removing that situation or that opportunity in your life as much as possible is a safe way to think about it.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I think just being aware when you're in those certain conditions, like boredom is one of them. Loneliness is another one. And if you're in a season of hurt or frustration, I mean, those are seasons of vulnerability where, from the standpoint of a Christian trying to live a celibate lifestyle that's honoring to God prior to marriage, you're going to have to face those seasons. And I think just being aware of those moments of vulnerability, seasons of vulnerability, that's going to be a big one. I think of Romans 13:14, put on the Lord Jesus Christ, make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. You think about the concept of making provision for something. If I were to go camping, to make provision for that, I'd have to bring my tent, my pillow, pots and pans, food, all that stuff to make it a successful trip. So you think about that in the reverse. Are you making it so that sin is successful in your life? So what are you surrounding yourself with? Where are you compromising on boundaries that you should be setting? If you're dating someone, are you hanging out alone all the time in environments where you know you're going to slip into this over and over again? You shouldn't be cuddling on the bed. You know, there's certain things. So I think being aware of that and asking yourself, what am I doing right now that's putting this temptation in front of me? What am I doing to guard against it? Am I filling up my cup with with things that are satisfying, you know, social elements. Do I have good friends? Am I working hard? This is one of the ones that I heard this on a message one time, and I've experienced this, man. If you are working hard, using the energy God has put in your body to do things that actually matter, that desire is not always going to be crouching at the door like it is oftentimes if we're bored and we're living kind of an apathetic, indifferent life. So I think there's a lot of different things, but it starts with being aware of, okay, what are my tendencies? What are those moments of vulnerability? Where do I find myself slipping?
I think too, even beginning to shift our mindset as far as like sex. I remember when I was younger, because it had been so infused from culture, sex was the ultimate thing. For me growing up. I remember telling I forget, I think it was talking to my mom at one point. We were driving somewhere. Say, I really don't want to die until I have sex. You know what I mean? Like, I love Jesus, but like, the whole concept of like, we're so our thoughts are always on it. It becomes the highest priority of our lives. And so essentially we set this, my daughter Abigail has a thing for Christmas, this timer that she puts on her phone, and it counts down to Christmas. She looks at it every single day. Well, that creates a level of misery in us of, you know what I'm saying? Like, we're not going to make it to whenever. So the idea of staying single for days, months, years, like that might be a daunting thing, and it might seem debilitating to go, I can't do that. If we shift our mindset and go, God has something for me in this season, what can I find from God? Knowing God is my ultimate good here. Learning how to find intimacy, learning how to be in relationship, how to be a good friend, how to do those things without the aspect of sexuality, though it is a good thing and it's a gift from God. Not the ultimate thing, you know what I mean? And so shifting the mindset to,
that's really good.
I can be single because sex isn't my end all be all.
Yeah.
Can I speak to just the females too?
Yeah. Sure.
Because it is different for us. We know this. Like, it's totally different for males and females. And from a female perspective, what I would say is pursue after modesty. I think that that's a huge one. And we all have our different evaluations of what modesty is. But I would just say, you know, seek God and pursue after modesty and how you act and how you dress. But the second thing I would say is be careful who you allow yourself to become emotionally attached to. Because as a female, that really is kind of the gateway for us, is that when we feel emotionally attached to someone, specifically a male, then we kind of start to continue down that path. And that's where it can lead for a female. So, you know, find Christian women to surround yourself with, allow them to be that support system until you find a spouse someday, and then they get to be that for you. But until then, just really be cautious and careful about who you're allowing yourself to emotionally connect with.
That's great. Let me speak to a few things. I have a couple thoughts on it. If you're a single person and you're trying to stay pure, let's just say you're single and not even dating, and so pornography is the issue that you're battling, you need to understand that pornography is training your brain. So you are alluding to this idea of that there's like other things going on, certain times of day, different things like seasons of life that can become triggers. I read an article, this was not a Christian article, because I study this consistently because of working with youth and also as a teacher. But I read this article where they did a study, and even as I say this, it sounds kind of strange as I first say it, but they realized people who were accessing pornography from the exact same place, so whether it's a computer in a certain room, that what they studied was there could be certain things in the room that could trigger their minds to desire pornography, even to the point if they saw a piece of furniture, or like in the one story that I read, this person had a hat on the computer, and because that hat was always there in the place where they engaged pornography, that hat actually subconsciously triggered their desires. And they were saying, like, that's how powerful it is. I think we have to be careful to then break those rhythms. If you're looking at pornography like always the same day, the same place, whatever it might be, is recognize you have to be, I would say, aggressive in removing those temptations from you. I mean, Jesus says it in Matthew that if your hand causes you to sin, if your eye causes you to sin, if your foot causes you to sin, gouge it out, cut it off. He's not talking about self-mutilation. He's talking about making changes that cost you something. That there's some suffering involved in that for the purpose of embracing purity. And so like for some people, I would say if pornography is an issue, you might have to get rid of a computer or smartphone. Be careful about the shows you watch.
Yep.
I'll hear people every once in a while reference shows that they watch that I know have a ton of nudity in it. And I'm like, man, you're different than me then, because if I watch those shows, that would definitely be a damaging thing in my mind and heart. They're not different than me, but they become numb to it.
Sure.
And that's the part of it. So I would say avoid those places. I would say if you start to date, understand this. And this is a principle I teach in youth ministry whenever I can. You need to understand the difference between affection and foreplay. And again, I'm going to be kind of blunt in my language here. A lot of people think if you're in a relationship, a dating relationship, it must lead to being physical. Like if it doesn't, then there's something weird about the relationship. And so how it progresses, every relationship is different. So like my dating relationship with Mary, we didn't even hold hands for a year. I'm not saying that's the norm, but that was just us. We didn't hold hands for a year. We didn't bring anything physical into it for a long time into our relationship. But one of the things that people need to recognize is you don't have to bring physical into a dating relationship. So physical, okay, I'm going to see you tomorrow. I love you. Goodbye. Hug and a kiss. That's affection, right? I'm going to stay here and make out. That's foreplay. That is a God-given thing that is prepping your body to prepare for sex. Well, there's no satisfaction or release of that until you have sex. So you are literally training your body to be frustrated and that desire to be greater. So what happens is every single time you're together, in order to get that next level of pleasure, you have to go further to the eventual part. And again, I know people, I'm comfortable, so I'm just gonna say, the only way you'll be fulfilled is in the orgasm when you get to that place. And so there are a lot of couples that are like, man, it's so hard to stay pure because they're like, we love each other, so we want to be affectionate. And you're like, well, understand the difference. You are launching your body down with foreplay. The last thing I would say to you is just avoid, in a dating relationship, avoid places where you're going to be more apt to make bad decisions. There was an article I read years ago. I've referenced this numerous times on different podcasts and things. I read this article, and this guy that was talking referred to it as the zone. And what he was talking about, he said, prior to the zone, you can make all the standards you want. I'll never do this. I'll never have sex before marriage. I'll never do these things. He goes, let's just be honest. When you start making out and you start getting physical, you enter the zone, and in the zone, your brain doesn't work. And he goes, the moment you're done, you step outside the zone and you have total clarity. You will have regret. You will have guilt. You have shame. You will be frustrated. Then he goes, before and after the zone, you think clearly. During the zone, you don't. He goes, in in the article, he said, avoid the zone. So avoid being alone in a home together, in a car together, if you're going to go park somewhere. Mary and I, that was a rule we had in our dating relationship. We dated throughout high school and college. We were never once in a home alone together. I'll see people post pictures that they're dating and they're laying in a bed together. And these are people I think have a commitment toward purity, but every time I see the pictures, I think, ugh, like you are putting yourself in a dangerous position. Families that allow their kids to go into their bedrooms with their boyfriends and girlfriends, I think is foolishness. It's so dangerous. So again, just avoiding those places, I think those are some key things. It requires purpose, behavior, it requires sacrifices, but they're important to do. All right. Now let's transition. So we spent Sunday. The energy was this redemptive idea. So I'm sure there's people in the crowd that are like, okay, we're married, but we don't have a healthy sex life. What does that even look like for a Christian? Because you have one extreme in our culture that is very much influenced by pornography. And so I think it's hard for some people to understand, what does a healthy sex life look like in a Christian marriage? So who wants to go first?
For me, I would say, excuse me, I would say viewing sex as an act of self-giving love, not as an act of self-gratification. I think that is a radical distinction between what Christians should think about sex versus what society believes about sex. So one of the dangers of not doing that is if sex is all about your gratification. Number one, I always tell this in marriage mentoring, like selfishness is the single greatest way to destroy your marriage in any topic, in any conversation, in any way. But particularly with in reference to sexuality, but also you begin to objectify your spouse, right? Rather than seeing them as a person to be loved, cared for, this is now a person who is a means to an end, my gratification. I think a part of that seeing sex as an act of self-giving love is being aware and concerned with the needs of your spouse. Paul talks a lot about this in 1 Corinthians 7, which I would encourage our viewers to go and read that, because he gives some pretty detailed instruction about.
Okay, it's funny. You just said that. I look at Chris's computer. He has 1 Corinthians 7 open, and I have it on mine right here, 1 Corinthians 7. So
I mean, because I love that he's very raw. He's raw about it, right? Yeah. The dangers of, for example, separating for too long. He talks about that, humans have desires. If you separate for too long, if physical intimacy is not a part of your marriage, you're going to be tempted. I think particularly in reference to men, but for both parties, if you're not being physically intimate, you're going to be tempted. So there's a lot of really cool instructions that he gives, but he paints that picture of sex being an act of self-giving love, but being aware of the other person's needs. Just having a conversation with a couple recently, the desire is usually different. Very rarely do you find that the desire level is exactly equal. Right. And usually if we're looking at stereotypes here,
husband-wife,
usually men have a much higher sex drive than women, and we could get into all that with testosterone and things. But I think one of the important things is that compromise, realizing, okay, my wife, she needs maybe more emotional connection. She needs things that I don't need as much, where for me, it's much more physical, right? So being aware of that dynamic. And again, if sex is an act of self-giving love, thinking in terms of what can I do to meet my spouse where they are, rather than always thinking they have to come to meet me where I am. Yeah. If you're both always doing that, you're always going to be cultivating intimacy if you're looking at it as an act of self-giving love to my spouse.
Right. Let me ask you a question, and Chris, you can answer too. I'm assuming because you got 1 Corinthians 7 on yours. There's a part in 1 Corinthians 7 that if you take it out of context, you look at it, it is very politically incorrect, very socially incorrect in the sense your body is not your own. Your husband owns your body if you're a wife. If you're a husband, vice versa. You own each other's bodies. I don't know how I just worded that. You know what I'm trying to say.
Wife owns your body if you're a husband, and if you're a wife, your husband owns your body.
Okay, let's be honest, we hear that and process that through a perverted culture, a culture of domineering, dominance, self-gratification. What you just said is the opposite. That's not what Paul is saying. But again, if you read that, so explain that for a second. So if someone were to just go, okay, Pastor Anthony just referenced 1 Corinthians 7, they open it up, and they're like, what? Walk them through just a little bit of Paul's context, like even what Paul expresses in Ephesians 5 about this idea of like mutual submission, mutual dying to yourself. Again, that's the beauty of what Paul is describing, what we talked about in the garden on Sunday of what it was supposed to be. But explain that a little bit so that people can understand and not read that and be afraid by it. Because if you have any abuse or anything in your past and you read that passage, your body is not your own. You're like, and unfortunately, I've known people who have used that passage of scripture to dominate their spouse. And I've had to explain to them, that's not the heart of it. But can you just take a moment, and then Chris, you can jump into.
Well, I mean, just real quick, the context, again, we're already looking at it from a Western context, as we've said, is all about this concept of individual autonomy. And so we would say that's equal for man and woman. But when you look at Paul's society at the time, right, it's a patriarchal society. Women have little to no rights at all, are basically seen as property to their husbands. What Paul is saying is absolutely radical in the first century culture, because he is saying that, no, there's actually not dominance on either party's part. What would have been expected is that the wife's body belongs to the man, and the man can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. He has that right, has that authority. The woman has no rights at all. So for him to say that a husband's body belongs to his wife is a radical departure from what was common in that society. But again, it goes back to this idea of, in a marriage, I'm not thinking about my spouse as a means to an end of personal happiness and gratification, particularly sex. I'm looking at this as an act of self-giving love that promotes oneness and intimacy. And again, at a deeper level than just physicality, of emotional intimacy, spiritual intimacy. So this, for me, is now not something I'm just doing, and I'm not demanding my own way so that I can be experiencing gratification. It's, I care about my spouse. I care about pleasing them. And that, again, is not the way our society views sex. Sex truly is it's a physical thing. It's a means to an end to gratify yourself. And that's it. Full stop.
Yeah. I can't get out of my mind the idea of Genesis 1 when God creates Adam and Eve naked and unashamed. And there's this idea and this picture of ultimate intimacy. And what is ultimate intimacy but full unadulterated trust in each other. And you want to know what you need to have a great sex life, and what Paul is really setting up here, filtering with that idea that you've just been presenting, Anthony. It's this idea of, if we can live in relationship with each other where we fully trust each other, sex becomes a fun thing. It becomes a life-giving thing. Mm-hmm. Why? Because there's no fear of shame. There's no fear of rejection. Mm-hmm. And so fostering trust, fostering intimacy creates a good sex life, and sex life contributes to
for sure
good intimacy. You know what I'm saying? So like they work kind of together. And if you take these passages and you go, that Paul says, and you go, you're going to give me what I want because Paul said that you're going to give me what I want. Yeah. That's not building intimacy or trust. You know what I mean? That is actually stripping it of intimacy and trust. And so if you want to find life in your sex life, if you want to, it's set on the foundation of trust. And from there, it just gets, it gets fun and creative. And so like, and you learn it together, because when you trust each other, you know what I mean?
For sure.
Get creative.
No, right. And it's beautiful and it's blessed, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
It is.
It's not perverted. It's just a wonderful thing. And that's why I am thankful for the book of Song of Solomon, because there are parts of that are very explicit. I mean, there are parts when you're reading it. Mm-hmm. What's funny is the language, because it's like the one I read on Sunday, like, your body is a palm tree. I don't think my wife would feel that as a compliment. You know?
Probably not.
The flock of goats coming down the mountain.
Yeah. Right.
Also, no.
Like even as Solomon says, he's like, your body is a palm tree. I want to climb the palm tree. You're like, I get what you're saying, but it feels kind of weird. But anyways, all that said is like, that's a part of the scriptures, because sexuality expressed in marriage is a beautiful thing. It's not weird. And you think about it, this is the generosity of our God, but it's also the strategy of our God. He puts two people together who though they could pleasure themselves, that's not the ideal. The ideal is for them to find a way to pleasure each other. So you have a felt need, a real need that can be fulfilled in the other person, but it's best, like you were saying, like, to create this safe environment where you learn each other and you speak and you communicate and you find out what the other person desires. And when your spouse meets you there in your need, it is very safe. It's very loving. So like, it is the safety that's created before sex, the safety that's created in sex, the intimacy before sex, the intimacy in sex. Like, it's just beautiful rhythm that happens. Okay, so do you want to add anything before I jump out?
Well, I was just going to say, it's being purposed too. And I think that the best way to experience it too is communication. I know that might sound silly, but like, that's something that we had to learn, is like being open in our communication about maybe what you do enjoy, what you don't enjoy, but also just like communicating with one another. Like, I need to be intimate with you. I need to feel close to you. Or, for me, I'm like, I need a little bit more emotional connection. And I think that is a key to having a healthy sex life in a marriage as well. Because I think it can almost be where it starts to then it does, you do experience other things, with it.
Do you mind for a second? Okay. So you're going to speak for all women.
Okay.
No, but there's a reality. I mean, like, this is, obviously there's outliers to anything, but Anthony alluded to it. The natural rhythm is the sex drive looks a certain way, typically with men. It looks differently for women. Oftentimes women will say, the pathway to intimacy begins with an emotional connection. What does that look like throughout the day? Because again, I am not in any way trying to be crude here, but a guy more often than not can be 3, 2, 1, go, we're ready, right? So like, that's the normal guy typically. A female, oftentimes I've heard that sex starts in the morning, like the beginning, like it's a process throughout the day of connection. Can you just speak to that? Like, what's the importance? Because I think there'd probably be some couples that would be watching this that would think, like, I don't need that, so therefore my spouse doesn't need that, and they need to be informed. They need to be educated on this.
I think it is learning what fills your spouse too. Like, I like to give like the love languages, figuring out what is it that fills up my cup. And I know for me, Ben is really good about throughout the day, just like, I love you, or just telling me things that he loves about me, or, I'm thinking about you right now. But then for me personally at home, he does the dishes, he helps
100%.
out with our daughter. If we're sitting on the couch, just, holding hands or giving me a hug. It's just those little purpose things that it's like, I'm thinking about you. I care about you. And even for me sometimes too, it's if I'm struggling, he listens, he doesn't necessarily try to fix the problem, but, oftentimes it's like, oh, man, you're really connecting with where I'm at, what I'm doing. And so it's being a good listener. It's showing them that you are thinking about them when you're not around them. It's helping with the kids. It's doing the dishes, whatever. Maybe your spouse is like, I love when you give me gifts, bring home flowers. That's the best way to, start with somebody who enjoys gifts. So I think it is just those little moments really do add up. To lead to that deeper intimacy.
Yeah, I had to learn that the hard way. I really did. Of like, even everything you're saying, I'm like, yeah, I had to learn that. Even throughout the day of like how doing the dishes 5 hours before evening plays into later intimacy.
100%.
Who said doing dishes wasn't sexy? They got it wrong.
They were wrong.
I know. But and like I've heard it said too of like affection, non-sexual affection, how important that is, where it's not just walking up to your spouse and grabbing them, right? Yeah. It's rubbing their back, it's giving them a hug, it's holding hands that doesn't have to lead to sex, and just those different things. But it happens through communication.
It's huge. Even if Ben just gives me a hug for like 20 seconds, I'm like, I needed that. Right. That can fill my cup up tremendously.
Yeah. What's you said about Ben, like just letting you know he's thinking about you. Ben's that way in general. He'll send me the kindest text around, but I appreciate it. Like I think on Sunday or sometime within the last week, it was just a random text, and I get them from him every few weeks of just, hey, thank you for this, and I just want you to know I'm praying for you. really kind stuff. He really is kind that way.
He's really good at that.
Yeah, he is. You guys, anything you want to add?
One of the things that I would say, again, going back to just thinking about the other, right? Not thinking about yourself, but thinking about the other. So recent conversation with a couple, he prefers spontaneity, right? So when it comes to sex, he loves the idea of like, let's just sneak away. We have a moment. Yeah. She does not feel necessarily the same way. It's not that she's closed off to that completely, but she is kind of fits the category of what we're talking about, something that's built up to that emotional intimacy, having a date night, setting aside time and intentionality. And what I would say, like, that's such a great case study in that what he can do is he can make that extra effort to do that, right? Absolutely. Realizing this is where my spouse is, I want to work towards that. But on the flip side, she can also entertain him at times and surprise him with spontaneity. Sure. And that is going to fill up his cup. And I think one of the things to don't want to speak for all men, but I do think oftentimes when it comes to men and sex drives, women can assume it's like you're just a pervert, you're just obsessed with sex. But it really is a way for men to also connect, that intimacy, not just physically, but emotionally, to feel close to their spouse. So again, I think that's where it goes into thinking about the other person's needs, thinking about the other person's desires, thinking about how they're wired, and approaching sex that way is going to add to just an incredible relationship.
And as a female, I would agree with that 100%, because there are times where it's like, I know that is your love language, that's what fills you up. And so I'm going to be purposed. I'm going to, put your needs above my own in this moment and allow for you to be fulfilled in that.
Yeah. I think one of the most damaging things a woman could ever do, or anyone in the spouse, it's just typically this way, is to make their spouse feel dirty about desiring them and wanting to connect to them, because that is a God-given desire. It's a beautiful thing, and it's actually something that should be celebrated. The fact that God even gave an increased sex drive to men is a gift to women, because it does bring the husband back physically and emotionally to his wife over and over, where he could have been independent and pulled away. And so it's a gift. But when women, either they make fun of it or they use it as a bargaining chip of like, well, if you do this, then we can have sex. They've just taken something that is beautiful and intimate and made it dirty and ugly. And you have to be very careful about that. But I do agree with everything you were saying about just having that conversation together to figure out, I can do for you what you need, but you need to also figure out what I need and have that conversation. And when you figure that out and start to do that, there's nothing more honoring than when you realize your spouse is changing their natural preference to meet your need. Yeah. That's the naked and unashamed part. That's that vulnerability where you go, man, I feel loved in that moment. Because I know in my life, what I've had to even recognize of what is it in my life that where I need Mary and intimacy that way. Because for me, I've discovered that when I feel very, very vulnerable in life, when things are feel a little bit out of control, I need Mary more than ever. I'm just thinking her as a person. And obviously a part of that is intimacy, but it's just like, I'm starting to realize that the way that I can feel secure in my life is connection. And so if you don't have that, for some people, they're pushing their spouse to go and find that security somewhere else. And sometimes, unfortunately, it happens with other people. Yeah. And that's why it's so dangerous. So it's our responsibility, it's our gift, it's our privilege to be able to do that.
I was going to say too, even in that, you've said this you said this Sunday when you taught, but you also said it years ago when you taught on sex and you gave the 14-day challenge. You said what this does is it creates the need for conversation, the need to address things. So when you hit moments like what you said, where one spouse might be dealing with some deep emotional wounds about revolving around sex, there really does the idea of being purposed to fulfill each other's needs that way might bring you to a place where you have to talk about some of those broken issues, where you have to walk down a journey of finding healing in those things. And so the act of sex and the presence of sex in a marriage creates more health in this way, because now you're dealing with the things where you're learning to love and understand your spouse, but you're also creating space for them to process through and find health in their own life. And so I tell you, one thing that was always like surprising to me was the practicality of sex life once in marriage. Right. I feel like this is a shift on what I started talking about, but just as I was hearing you guys talk and thinking about it, like I was surprised by how I'm trying to think of the way to word this in a safe way. So it's not. I don't want to put Cassie in a weird place, you know what I mean? But like we have different expectations, and if you don't verbalize those expectations, if you don't express those things in a very practical way, it creates a lot of frustration in a marriage. And so like the need for just that, hey, I'm feeling the need for sex tonight. So, and you know what I mean? Being able to express 100%. That.
Didn't we all, I don't want to speak this to everyone, but I think to some degree, everyone anticipates that sex in marriage is going to be almost
always spontaneous.
Yeah, spontaneous, like almost a rom-com, right? Yeah, like it's like we spent a lot of time today, funny, in another conversation talking about different, I don't even know how to even give this context, okay? We were talking about romantic novels and different things and where they fall. Again, how did that come up in the office? I have no idea. But anyway, but it has created a problem in that in our minds, you see these movies, you read these books, and you think like, yeah, it's going to be natural, it's going to be seamless. Yeah. And what it is oftentimes way more practical than it is spontaneous, from whether it be just the blunt, I need sex tonight or now type thing, or even scheduling it. Yeah. I remember years ago I was talking to this couple and they were like, basically they hadn't had sex in weeks, months even. And their schedules did not align for them to have sex at night. So they weren't having sex. And I was like, why don't you have it in the morning? And they were like, they looked at me like, what? And I was like, schedule it. Yeah, like just schedule it. If you need to get up a little bit earlier and you need, or both of you need to get up earlier, do it. And they started doing it, and it actually became fun for them, obviously, and stuff like that. But anyways, all that said, I think we almost might be disappointed in that to go like, but that's not the romantic. I would say, you know what? It's better than nothing. Yeah. And it can lead to, I think, health in other areas. Yeah,
for sure.
I had another friend of mine. I'm not going to, again, just keep saying friends. I had a friend of mine where he said that him and his wife aligned their days off together, and what a difference it made, because he's like, and he was just blunt with us, and it was nothing crude about it. He goes, it's honestly turned into a really good day to have sex because our schedules finally align. He goes, it's been really good for our marriage. And I was like, that's great that's a part of your rhythm. Okay. So, just looking through the questions, some of them we already kind of naturally covered. So what are some hindrances? I mean, back up. I think we've addressed this, but why is it important to prioritize intimacy in marriage? Because it is a God-given thing, and it's critical to keep the health of the marriage going, right? Do you want to expound on that, why it's so important to prioritize it?
Well, I know sometimes for us, if we haven't prioritized it, you feel this tension between each other, and sometimes it's like you don't know why. You're like, why am I upset? Why is everything you're doing frustrating me? And then, like, isn't
that a vivid example of marriage? Or, you're breathing right now. It's driving me nuts.
But often, 9 times out of 10, it's because, oh wait, it has been a minute since we have partaken in this, and so it's like it is that almost like that reconnection thing. It's like, okay, we've reconnected and we feel so much better afterwards. You know, it's like, okay, I feel more connected. You're not bothering me anymore. I'm not agitated with you. So it helps you realign, reconnect, and kind of takes care of some of that frustration, you know, that you're feeling.
And Chris, you alluded to the 14-day challenge. You know, this is something that's become almost legendary in our church. I challenged people years ago. I actually did more than one occasion, but years ago, for couples to have sex for 14 straight days. And we talked about this week in the office, but it was not me being flippant or crude or crass in any way. Right. What I knew, and I had a whole strategy behind it, but what I knew was going to force people, if they were going to do it, it was going to force them to address other issues. And the positive feedback that I got back was, and even some funny stories where I remember one couple said that they basically on the way home, and if you knew this couple, she was funny, but like a little bit more aggressive in a funny way. And she just like looked at her husband and said like, all right, we're going to have sex for 2 weeks, but we're going to have some difficult conversations. And he was like, deal. But they jokingly came back and they were both talking to me saying like, it really did. It forced them to have some conversations about some like unsaid frustration, some things that were going on. I had other couples said they realized in order to do it, which I was so honored as a pastor that they even took the challenge seriously, but they said in order to do it, we had to really work our schedules. And then we started to realize we just haven't been making that a priority. We were not prioritizing each other. And even the simple things of like getting a calendar book out at the time, they had calendar books and they were like, writing the dates in and the times of the days that they were going to have sex. And they were like, this is so weird. But they're like, we really enjoyed the challenge and the process of it. And again, it goes back to that. It might not always be spontaneous, but if you plan it, it can still be so beneficial to the marriage. And
I was just going to say, this might be a guy thing, but I feel more like this was a way that and it took communicating this to Cassie, but this was a way that when she would prioritize this in our marriage and when we would connect through sex, it was a way of lighting my heart up and my emotions up and me feeling valued by her. So it's that the importance of that is you can walk around frustrated all the time going, do I even matter to this person anymore? Right. You know what I mean? And so finding those ways, sexual intimacy is one way, but also the emotional health and connecting in all the ways that we've already talked about. So, but that is something that I've had to discover is like, oh, that is important to me. And that's a way that Cassie shows that I'm important to her. And so like communicating has been important. So.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I mean, really, it's just another way of saying that it's interconnected with our relational health, you know, emotionally, spiritually, all those other ways. And I think that's one thing that I would want people to take away is to realize again that it's not just physical. It's not just physical. Yeah. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner we will realize the need to work on all the things surrounding intimacy, the consequences, the positive consequences of having a healthy sex life, but also the things that we need to do to get a healthy sex life and being more present emotionally and having conversations and putting things on the calendar and making sure that busyness doesn't overcrowd those things, because it really, in a lot of ways, is the measure of our connectedness as a couple, how intimate we're, you know, and we don't want people to end up as roommates. And how many people have ever said, you know, in their marriages, there's seasons where it feels like we're roommates, feels like we're, you know, ships passing each other in the night, we're doing our own things. And as that continues, obviously that can have very damaging effects if that is not reversed. And intimacy is one of the ways that that's reversed.
All right. What are some hindrances to intimacy in marriage and how do you overcome them? I'll name one and then you guys can name some. I think just busyness. I think it's easy to keep saying yes to things. And I think one of the things that people need to do in marriage is make sure that they're not saying yes to things that are going to impact intimacy. And again, I'm not just talking sex. So like in my life, Mary and I, when Mary, she was a stay-at-home mom when our kids were younger, when they went back to school, she's a teacher by trade. One of the reasons she didn't go back into teaching was she would have to work Fridays. That was my day off. And most Saturdays, to some capacity, I'm still thinking about Sunday. It's not a great day off for me. And so in order for us to continue to just have that quality time together, we knew Fridays would be important. So she didn't go back to teaching and then later on came on staff here. But that's because we wanted to align our schedules. I think it might sound very simple, but it was profound to our marriage for that to line up. But I think people agree to a lot of things, are super busy, and they don't prioritize the marriage. One of the saddest things I remember hearing from a couple of years ago was them saying, like, basically they hadn't been together in a single evening because one parent was taking a group of their kids one way, the other parent was taking the other kids the other way. And so like you were saying, they were just ships passing in the night. And so they were prioritizing their kids over their marriage. And I'm like, guys, this is super dangerous because when your kids move out, you might have been roommates for such a long time that there's not that intimacy. And so I do think busyness is one of the biggest hindrances to intimacy. What are some other ones?
I mean, I would say selfishness. And I would say this twofold again, as we've really already hit on it. Number one, selfishness in sex. If your spouse perceives that sex is ultimately all about you, it's not going to be something that they're very open to. But I would also say it's all the things leading up to it. If you're not like actively looking for ways to build up and serve your spouse, that's another act of selfishness that's going to become a barrier before you even get to sex. So I think it's those both ways, just thinking through how am I relating to my spouse on a normal everyday basis, and even how do we approach sex now? How do I talk about it? How do I ask for it when I want it? Am I making demands? Am I insisting on my own way? Is my spouse feeling objectified where they are a means to an end to get what I want? All of those things are going to destroy intimacy.
I would say previous hurt and trauma, or maybe even previous sexual experiences, can be a hindrance to sexual intimacy in a marriage. If you're working through where you've experienced trauma, particularly sexually or in really any way, where you've been abused or used, like that can be a huge hindrance to sex. And that because sex is built on trust. If trust is damaged, you know what I mean? Like even if you trust your spouse, if there's that underlying thing going, I can't trust men, I can't trust women, I can't, you know what I'm saying? That's something to be dealt with. And so like that needs to be dealt with so that there can be freedom and trust within the relationship. So that's a hindrance. And I think too, like just breaking down those past experiences and that past shame and working through those things. And I would say together are ways to kind of get past the hurt and the damage that can happen. I mentioned earlier on, I said, shame is something that still can be present when you've had past sexual experiences. But the healing side of that is that you work together in a relationship and it can be overcome. But it takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of honest conversation, and it takes a lot of just honesty and patience with each other to work through those things to restore that intimacy. And so,
and we would highly recommend getting professional help, counseling, with that. That's not something that we're saying you need to just figure out on your own. There's good books and different things, but a professional counselor, I would even say Christian counselor, would be a key to that.
So I will probably say the word that every single female would say: life, like just life. I mean, and in all honesty, because we've discussed this, like we do look at it a lot differently. Life does look different for a female, and there are days where it's just like I'm exhausted. My daughter has tried my patience. Maybe it was a rough day here. I was dealing with things, and sometimes my emotions and just the weight of the world can get the best of me when it comes to this. And so it's something where I have had to learn to be super purposed, whether it's like, hey, can you take cadence for like a half an hour so that I can decompress and I can be, in the, not just in the moment, but then, potentially intimate with you later, potentially connecting with you on a deeper level. So I know as a female, we carry a lot differently than you do. And so I think that just life in general can be a hindrance. And I think it all goes back to that. You have to be super purposed. You have to be open in communication, and you have to serve and love one another, because that really is the way that it's going to work best.
This is great stuff. All right, final question. Actually, this is just for you, Chris, you and me, only because you guys have young kids that I don't think you've started the conversations yet with them because of their age. But if you have something you want to add, you can. We both have kids that are now, our youngest are the same age, which is 12 years old. And then we have kids that are in high school.
Yep.
A parent might be listening to this going, I want to start these conversations with my kids. What does that look like? Because I think it's super intimidating.
I'd like to know the answer to this.
I can speak for me, how it's looked, and you can speak for you. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
All right, let me start. For us, we've been really purposed. I would say probably younger than most people would realize that 10 years old, around there, 10 year, 11, to start the conversation where it's, for me, it was the three boys. I took them privately and made it a fun night, which is super weird in the sense of like, we're going to go to an arcade. We're going to have fun. We're going to get, a good dinner and ice cream. And we're also going to have a talk that's going to rock your world. And all my kids responded differently, from some that just kind of handled it matter of fact and asked questions to one of my sons was like, thank you, but I don't want to continue this conversation. To another one who just nodded and was like, all right, cool. Like we'll talk later. But what that also did was allow, one of the things I expressed with them is you can ask me any questions in the future. And after that, my kids would come to me and would share things that they heard at school. And some of the most foul and crude things that honestly, as a parent, infuriated me, frustrated me, hurt my heart, but I never expressed that to my kids. They would come and say, Dad, and then fill in the blank, right? I heard this phrase or this comment at school, and I would go, oh, thank you so much for bringing that question to me. That's a great question. And I would explain it to them. I never wanted them to feel like it's awkward. It's an awkward thing to have to engage us in this topic. And there's really purpose follow-up from having conversations to even, I have tons of protection around what my kids watch and listen to. And so like, I do not give any of my kids free access to the internet. Only one of my kids has one form of social media where I have his passwords and can still check and follow it. We don't use social media any other way. Restrictions, again, on all of their devices. We do not have a computer in our home that they can just have access to the internet unless it's in our presence, that, if they're doing schoolwork and stuff. But again, it was just having purpose conversations because we wanted it to be an ongoing thing so that in the future, when they have more questions, they feel comfortable to come back. That's what my parents modeled to me. I always felt like I was honoring my parents to ask them a question. I never felt like it was weird or dirty. So I wasn't even nervous growing up. Like I didn't even have that context. I would just go to my parents and go, hey, can I ask you something? And I didn't realize what a gift that was that they gave me. So we're trying to create that for our kids. So I talked to the three boys, Mary talked to our daughter, and so we just had those ongoing conversations. How about you? What did it look like in your guys' life?
I was going to say it's very similar. We started really young with conversations with my son. He was about 8 years old. And in an age-appropriate way, we started having conversations about what it looks like when your friends bring their phone to school, and if they show you a picture, if they those types of things. And so because he didn't have a phone at that time, and that was a newer thing. Like he was like on the cusp of that last generation of having a childhood without a phone. But but we started to have these conversations of like, hey, like if this comes up, come and talk to us, and we did. In my life growing up, it was always a joking thing when you talked about sex. And so it was something I was uncomfortable with. We were super purposed to never make it an uncomfortable thing for them. Yeah. If they have questions, we never made them feel silly for asking it. If they had, if it was something that was like, like they were just curious about, we were always open and honest with them. Yeah. We always tried to be age appropriate. And I mean, we weren't telling an 8-year-old like the full picture and scope of it, but but as he grew, we began to have those conversations in more depth and more detail about that, and then just also the same thing, just trying to create boundaries. The thing that we tell our kids is that we don't put boundaries around your lives for the times that you're on your best moment. We always tell them we put boundaries in your lives for those dumb moments that you have, so that you're protected in those moments, and so. We've always tried to kind of to walk our kids through that, and so yeah, that's kind of what we did. It's not much different than I would say what you did. But
have your kids been frustrated with you at times?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I mean, my kids have been furious with us at times, hurt at times. We're the only kids in the world who have these rules. Type of deal. And I always communicate. I never get mad at their hurt. I never get mad at their frustration. I acknowledge it. I apologize about it in the sense of I go, I'm sorry that you have to go through that. I really am. But I also communicate through vision. It's just how I am as a leader. But I talk to them, I'm like, and I try to give them examples of how they can understand it. I'm like, to my kids, I'm like, when you have children, if you had the possibility to protect them from something or to give them access to something that could destroy their life and future marriage, like at what point would you give them access to that? And they're like, I understand it. And they'll say it, and like, they'll calm down. They'll go, I understand. It's just hard. And I go, it is, guys. I'm so sorry. And because I don't want to be the guy that just goes like, hey, it is what it is. My rules, take it or leave it, because I don't want them to resent it on that level. But I just want to meet them where they're at. And so it's tough because, like, I mean, my daughter doesn't even have a cell phone yet. Like, we don't give that until later. But they don't have social media. Like, I have all these restrictions from my phone that can block, from the amount of time they can even use their phone every single day. And none of their friends have that. And so it is a tension, but ultimately, as a parent, I'm called to protect them as much as I'm able until they're an adult and can handle that alone. So even my son Cole, when he went to college this year and we sat down and I started to remove those restrictions, I said, buddy, like, I'm going to remove some restrictions, but I'm going to encourage you not to just go crazy here, to just go like, okay, restrictions are gone. And he appreciated that. The conversation we have, and he hasn't just added every single form of social media. He still has those restrictions because he knows, like, that's a dangerous pathway.
I was just going to say, the amount of times that I've had conversations with my kids where they go, "Don't you trust me?" And those are some of the most difficult. Those are the most difficult things to explain because you want to say yes and no all at the same time. There's nothing wrong with you in particular, you know what I mean? You've done nothing wrong. That's not what we're addressing here. But at the same time, you're a human being and I'm a human being and I know the proclivity of human beings. And so, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, so there's that level of like, yes, I trust you. No, I don't trust you. And you have to be willing to have those conversations with your kids. And so,
and you don't trust what's out there. Like, it's like, I definitely don't trust culture and I don't trust social media and I don't trust all of that stuff. So I think that's another huge part of it too.
Yeah. It's a different game. When I was in high school, if you wanted to access pornography, you had to go out and get a physical something, a magazine book, whatever.
Much more difficult.
Nowadays, with it on a device, it's just different. And the accidental exposure that can happen. I mean, there are just times, like, I've shared with my own wife where, like, all of a sudden there's something inappropriate that I'm surprised by, and I'll just let her know, like, sorry, that popped up. I don't want you to think I was looking at something. And even for my own life, like, I'm not violating this, but my wife has every password to every device of mine because I'm just like, I don't have anything to hide, but I also don't want to be able to hide something because I don't want to even have that rhythm in my own life.
A cell phone is like floating in an ocean of a boat with a million holes in it. You're trying to plug. There's just so many different avenues to, and if you're a parent and you're trying to create those boundaries and you're finding it hard to keep everything off of it, it's hard. There's a million different ways for that content to get around, even the protections that you put on their phone. So just be diligent and just keep having conversations. I think building the relationship with your kids and creating that space where you can have open and honest conversations in their successes and their failures with it is the most healthy thing that you can do in creating a healthy idea of sexuality growing up.
That's good.
Even their failures. I think that's key. And we're not going to go too much in depth of that in the sense of any risk that we would embarrass our children. But if your kids do come to you and there has been a failure, to not freak out about that, to meet them and say, okay, thank you so much for, or if you discover it, hey, I want to talk about this, but to not make it the end of the world so that you can continue to build that trust, because you don't want to so respond in a way that from that point on, they're ultra secretive and shut down. You want to say, okay. And I remember even growing up, my dad had that posture with me and my brothers of like it seemed like the bigger the failure, the more calm he was. And I respected that. And it helped us have a place of safety. Well, thank you so much, all three of you, very much for just being so comfortable about this topic and transparent. I really do hope and we believe that this is a blessing to all of you that are engaging. And we always say it, if this is a blessing to you, feel free to share it.
Can I share one more thing before we close up? I could tell where you're at. I just wanted to speak to, if you're in a place and you've lived or experienced failure in sexuality and in your life, I just want to speak to that for just a second. First of all, the grace of Jesus Christ is bigger than any sin that we ever commit.
Right.
I know we talked about the damaging effects of sex and sex outside of God's design, and it is very serious and it's very damaging. But it is not bigger than the grace of Jesus Christ. And so there is hope for positive marriages if you've made that mistake. There is hope for a good sex life with your spouse if you've made that mistake. Jesus Christ can heal absolutely everything and anything. And I hope that if you're listening to this and you live in that space where you're like, oh man, you fill in the blank. I hope what you hear from all of this is that God does have a great design for you, that there is grace in our mistakes and in our failures, and that doesn't disqualify you from the life and the hope that he has for you. So that's all I wanted to say.
That's great, Chris. Thank you for doing that. And if you need any help, feel free to reach out. If you're a male and you want to reach out to one of our pastors, you could do so at info@Tree.Church, or you could call into the church or see us on Sunday. We're all around. I promise you will be met with discretion and care. You will not embarrass us. You're not freak us out. If you're a female, any of our female directors would be more than happy to communicate with you. Just because of this podcast, you see 3 of us that are willing to, for the male side, Stacy on the female side. But again, there's just so many others that would be willing to sit down, talk with you, and figuring out a plan to help you get that help you need, whether it's counseling or whatever it might be. So if this is a blessing to you, share it with family and friends. And thank you for tuning in. We love you guys, and we'll see you soon. God bless.